Voices beneath the floor. I first heard it 3 nights ago. Faint scratching that seemed to crawl beneath the hardwood floor of my bedroom. At first, I thought it was a tree branch brushing the side of the house. But when I crept out of bed and pressed my ear to the cold planks, the scratching intensified. It sounded closer, more deliberate. It seemed impossible, but I could swear I heard something whispering my name. My parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, and my younger brother, Jonah, teased me mercilessly the next morning at breakfast. He mimicked ghostly wails and told me to check for boogeymen. I tried to laugh it off, but a lingering unease settled in my stomach. There was something down there. I was certain of it. The following night, the scratching returned, louder than before. This time, I heard it from the living room, traveling along the floorboards as though something was pacing right beneath my feet. My father finally acknowledged it, too. I watched his face pale. He nodded at me, silently confirming that what I'd heard was real. We told Mom, who suggested calling an exterminator. None of us admitted we thought this was far bigger and far stranger than just rats. What bothered me most was the voice. I couldn't decipher the words, only that faint hissing that coiled around my thoughts whenever the house grew quiet. The sounds drifted in and out, half-formed pleas laced with something like desperation. In a single moment of clarity, I thought I heard the words, "Set us free," but when I tried to focus, all I got was frantic scraping and murmuring, like countless nails beneath the floor, pleading to be let out. By the 3rd night, none of us could sleep. Jonah's bed was next to mine, and I could hear him tossing and turning. Moonlight cut a path across the floor as I sat upright, waiting for that inevitable sound. A sudden chill ran through me when the scratching started again, always starting in one corner of the house and drifting, as though the unseen thing beneath us was patrolling. Dad stomped into the hallway, flashlight in hand, and motioned for me to follow. The floorboards creaked with each step, but the scratching persisted, weaving an unsettling duet with our hurried footsteps. We crept into the living room where Mom was standing on a chair, pressing her ear down to the floor. Her eyes were wide with fear. She motioned for silence, and we all froze. That was when the whispering rose again, no longer timid but harsh and urgent. My legs quaked as I realized it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple. Murmured pleas overlapped in a haunting chorus. My father sank to his knees, pressing his palm flat against the boards, his jaw clenched. I saw him shudder, as if he felt something pushing back from underneath. Suddenly, Jonah screamed from behind us. He'd been standing at the edge of the room, pointing to a spot on the floor. A thick, dark liquid was seeping through the cracks. It looked almost like oil, but it smelled foul. A metallic tang that made bile rise in my throat. Mom jumped back, her face twisted in horror. Dad grabbed Jonah and pulled him close. "Go get towels," Mom shouted, but we all hesitated. I watched a droplet fall onto the rug and spread into a tiny black stain. The voices hissed louder. My mind spun with questions I couldn't begin to answer. We had to find out what was down there, and we had to do it soon. The next morning, the stains on the rug had dried into a crusty black patch. We carefully lifted the rug to inspect the floorboards. Each one seemed intact, but the pungent odor still lingered. Dad decided to call a contractor friend to see if there was any known substructure or crawl space beneath the living room. Meanwhile, Mom insisted we set up a camera to record the floor overnight. I tried to act normal around Jonah, but I caught him frequently glancing at the dark spot, as if expecting something to seep through again. My own stomach twisted at the thought of it. I remembered the feeling of that cold, sticky substance against my fingertips when I gingerly touched the droplet. It made my skin crawl. That evening, Jonah and I huddled around the camera setup, triple-checking the battery and memory. Mom hovered behind us, hugging herself as though a draft had swept through the room. Dad paced back and forth, his face tight with worry. None of us had dared to look under the floor yet. Something told me that whatever we found would change everything. At exactly 2 in the morning, the scratching began. I turned on the living room light just enough to see the camera's red recording light blink. From my vantage point by the couch, I noticed the floorboards shifting ever so slightly, like the floor itself was breathing. Jonah snapped his gaze to me in silent confirmation. We both saw it. Then came the voices, faint at first, but quickly multiplying into a cacophony of urgent pleas. It felt like an entire crowd was trapped beneath us, pressing their mouths to the boards, begging to be heard. Dad's face went ashen. He seized a crowbar from the toolkit and stared at the center of the living room floor with grim determination. We no longer had a choice. We had to tear up those boards. I stood behind Dad, heart pounding, as he wedged the crowbar into the nearest gap between the planks. Jonah grabbed my arm, and I felt him trembling. Mom hovered in the doorway, her face drawn. We all expected something terrible, but no one could have predicted what we were about to witness. The first board came loose with an agonized squeal of wood. Underneath lay a jagged hole leading into darkness. A rancid stench surged upward, forcing us to stagger back. My eyes watered, and my lungs burned with each breath. Undeterred, Dad pried up more boards until an opening wide enough for a person appeared. We aimed our flashlights into the hole, revealing the start of a narrow passage. The walls were made of ancient stone and lined with what looked like crude carvings. A chilling gust of air wafted out, bringing with it the unmistakable sound of whispering voices. Mom whispered that this must be some kind of forgotten cellar or storage space, but the stones looked far older than our house's foundation. I felt a rush of cold fear in my chest. This was not some ordinary cellar. My mind was drawn to the cryptic whispers I'd heard. Set us free. Dad tried to lower himself in, and Jonah and I helped steady him. The beam of his flashlight disappeared into the gloom. It goes on farther, he murmured. This isn't just a small crawl space. I sensed the faint brush of cold hands on my ankles, though there was nothing there, just the swirling darkness. The voices seemed to stir in excitement. Something was waiting for us below, and it was calling, beckoning us to come deeper, promising answers we might not want to hear. I took the lead, knees shaking as I climbed down the makeshift ladder Dad had fashioned from a few 2x4s in the garage. My flashlight flickered across rough stone walls etched with bizarre symbols. The tunnel sloped downward at a slight angle, and the air turned colder with every step. Behind me, Jonah whispered my name, his voice quivering. My parents exchanged worried looks, but they followed anyway. The deeper we went, the louder the whispers grew, echoing off the stones. I swear I could feel them brushing against my ears like intangible fingertips. We emerged into a cramped chamber with a low ceiling that forced us to stoop. The floor was slick with moisture, and the odor of decay hung thick. Our flashlights revealed a series of archways branching out in different directions. My father swore under his breath. This was no mere cellar. It was a labyrinth. As we shone our lights into one archway, the whispering fell silent. We turned the beam onto the next, and the whispers resumed. It was as if the unseen voices were herding us, guiding us toward a specific path. I felt my heart hammer in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity and a strange compulsion pushed me onward. Jonah almost slipped on the damp stone, and Mom caught him before he hit the ground. Dad stepped ahead, testing each step. We moved slowly, fear amplifying every subtle sound, drips of water, our shallow breathing, an eerie scraping on the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed a shape flicker in the darkness. It vanished the moment I tried to focus my flashlight on it, leaving only that nagging sense we were not alone. We followed the corridor's twists and turns until we reached a larger chamber with a domed ceiling. A rotted wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by toppled stools. My flashlight illuminated strange symbols carved into the tabletop, eerie shapes resembling contorted faces, each one etched with painstaking detail. Jonah gagged and covered his nose. The stench here was worse, thick and suffocating. Dad ran his hand across one of the carvings, then recoiled as if it burned him. Mom muttered something about ancient rituals, her voice cracking with fear. Suddenly, the whispering erupted into a collective wail. The air vibrated with tortured screams, and I felt a sharp pain lance through my temples. The light from our flashlights wavered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Mom screamed in terror. I grabbed Jonah and pulled him close, trying to steady my own breathing as fear threatened to overpower me. Voices overlapped, shrieking words in an archaic language. Yet amid the chaos, I heard fragments of English. Release, trapped, centuries. My eyes darted across the room. The shadows seemed to writhe and cling to our movements. Dad clenched his fists, brow knitted in pain. I realized then we were dealing with something beyond simple ghosts. These spirits, whatever they were, had been sealed in this underground maze for a reason. As quickly as the shrieking rose, it fell silent. Each of us stood trembling, flashlights shaking in our hands. It was like standing in the wake of a horrific storm. Every nerve in my body frayed. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of a pale figure at the far edge of the chamber, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. Then it flickered out of sight, leaving only an echo of its anguished cries ringing in my ears. We discovered a passage branching off to the left. Following it led us to a corridor lined with old iron sconces. Amazingly, some held stubby remnants of ancient candles. Each step felt like an intrusion into a sacred space that despised our presence. My palms sweat around the flashlight, and my pulse thundered. The corridor curved, descending further into the earth. The floor beneath our feet turned muddy, sucking at our shoes with every step. My father pointed his flashlight at the walls, revealing more carvings, this time of chained figures and monstrous silhouettes looming over them. The detail was so disturbingly precise, I felt like I could see agony in every etched face. A cold gust pressed against us. Jonah stumbled and nearly dropped his flashlight. Mom caught her breath, then aimed her own beam down the corridor. That was when we saw a faint glow flickering at the far end, like candlelight dancing in a breeze. We exchanged looks of alarm. Any logical explanation felt impossible. Yet, there it was, a tiny, wavering flame in the darkness. We approached, each step accompanied by the echo of dripping water. The corridor eventually opened into another cramped room, smaller but eerily decorated with archaic symbols on every wall. In the center stood a single candle, burning on the stone floor. There was no sign of any living person. Its flame cast a ghostly aura, illuminating small bones scattered around it. Animal bones, I tried to convince myself, but the shapes were too small, too delicate, like the remains of something once human. I shivered. The candle sputtered then flared, brightening the entire room with a sudden burst of light. In that instant, I heard a piercing scream that felt as though it echoed inside my skull. Then the flame died, plunging us into blackness again. When the darkness swallowed us, I fumbled for my flashlight switch. My hands were shaking so badly, it felt like an eternity before the beam cut through the black. Jonah whimpered, pressing close. Dad steadied Mom, who looked on the verge of fainting. The candle on the floor was snuffed out, its wick trailing a thin thread of smoke into the cold air. As we swept our flashlights around, we realized that the bones on the floor weren't the only remains. In the corners of the room, shadows took shape. Partially buried skeletons slumped against the walls. Rusted shackles remained bolted around their ankles and wrists. I gasped, stepping back, trying to keep my stomach from lurching. Mom covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Dad looked sick, eyes darting across the room. This place was a tomb, and these skeletal figures were its prisoners. A fresh wave of whispers rippled through the air. Only now, they seemed more coherent. The voices repeated words like cursed, tormented, and vengeance. Goosebumps erupted across my skin. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a silhouette glide past. It paused at the doorway, turning a hollow gaze upon us. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only a trail of sorrow that weighed me down like lead. Jonah swallowed hard. "Why would anyone do this?" he asked, voice trembling. Dad's flashlight beam landed on a cluster of symbols etched onto a stone tablet propped against the far wall. The carving depicted hooded figures encircling a pit of flames, forcing others into the fire. Above them, monstrous shapes watched from the darkness. The text beneath was in an unknown script, but one word was carved in English at the very bottom. Damned. We decided to record everything on our phones, hoping to capture evidence of what we were experiencing, and perhaps piece together a clue about how to escape this nightmare. Each step brought new horrors. Deeper tunnels, half-collapsed passages, and scattered relics. In some corridors, we found tattered robes and broken pottery, as if left behind in a desperate rush. Meanwhile, the voices followed us. Whispered pleas merged with anguished screams that seemed to echo from centuries ago. Whenever we lingered too long in one spot, the voices intensified, urging us onward. It was as though the labyrinth itself was alive, orchestrating our path. Eventually, we reached a small alcove where a crumbling wall revealed a hidden library of sorts. Dusty scrolls and books heaped in disarray. Jonah and I carefully sifted through them, trying not to sneeze from centuries of dust. Mom found a lantern, an old brass relic. Incredibly, it still had some oil left, so we lit it. The warm glow dispelled the claustrophobic darkness, but it also illuminated the rotting shelves, thick with cobwebs. One ancient journal written in archaic English caught my eye. In it, someone named Gregory M. revealed that a secret cult had used this labyrinth to imprison vengeful spirit, who had once been human but were transformed by ritual sacrifice. He described how these spirits were sealed beneath the earth to protect the surface world from their fury. My heart thundered. The words echoed the torment we'd witnessed. The skeletons in chains, the pit of flames. Dad took one look at the text and grimaced. "We have to find a way out," he muttered, "and we need to figure out how to keep whatever this is from coming after us." But the whispers swirled around us, as if mocking his resolve. Their volume grew, culminating in a collective hiss that chilled my spine. Jonah's flashlight shone on a piece of parchment tucked between pages of the ancient journal. The paper was brittle and yellowed with age, covered in strange sigils. At the bottom was a rough sketch, a door-shaped stone archway with a heavy chain across it. Next to it, in shaky handwriting, read, "The only path to break the curse." Dad leaned over my shoulder, reading each word slowly. According to Gregory M.'s cryptic notes, this stone archway was crucial. If opened improperly, the spirits would be unleashed in full force. But if something was done with the correct invocation, the spirits might move on or remain sealed. The instructions were incomplete, but it was clear this labyrinth was intended as a prison. I glanced at Jonah, whose expression betrayed both hope and fear. If we could find that archway, maybe we could free ourselves and possibly free the tortured souls as well. Mom nodded, urging us to keep searching, but her voice trembled. I realized she felt responsible for our safety and was terrified of what might be required to break the curse. Armed with the lantern, we navigated deeper through the maze, guided by the cryptic maps scrawled in the journal's pages. On the way, we encountered more unsettling sights. Hewn walls bearing symbols of agony, footprints embedded in dried blood, and corridors that looped back on themselves, forcing us to backtrack. Eventually, we found a sloped passage that matched the rough outlines on the ancient map. We trudged downward, the air growing so cold our breaths became visible. My fingers felt numb around the lantern's handle. Ahead, a towering stone archway loomed, partially collapsed. Massive chains were draped across it like a barricade. My heart jumped. This had to be the sealed door from the journal sketch. The archway stone was carved with intricate runes, now worn almost smooth by time. Massive chains stretched across it, each link crusted with rust. In the center, an iron lock dangled, brittle yet somehow still intact. I glanced at Jonah, who exhaled shakily, then at Dad, who seemed lost in thought. Mom clutched the journal pages, her lips moving silently as she attempted to parse Gregory M.'s notes. Lighting the lantern, I stepped closer. My fingertips brushed the lock, and the metal seemed to pulse with a strange warmth, defying the icy air around us. The labyrinth responded with a crescendo of whispers, as if the entire place was waiting for us to make a move. We struggled to interpret the instructions on the parchment. Portions were missing, eaten away by mold or centuries of neglect. The words that remained hinted at a key, a relic that would fit this lock, and an incantation that must be spoken during the unlocking to ensure the spirits pass on rather than break free in rage. We had no key, just the cryptic phrase, "Blood binds, will freeze." Jonah suggested maybe our own blood could act as the key, but the idea made my stomach twist. Dad frowned, pacing back and forth. Mom's gaze flickered from the parchment to the lock, then back again. Finally, Dad took a small utility knife from his pocket and pressed its tip to his palm. "We either try, or we stay trapped here," he said. My breath caught in my throat as he squeezed his eyes shut and let a few drops of blood spill onto the iron lock. The voices swelled in intensity. I could practically feel them swirling around us, eager and impatient. The moment Dad's blood touched the rusted lock, an unnatural rumbling shook the archway. My heart hammered as I watched cracks spiderweb across the chain links. A low moan emanated from the stones, as though the labyrinth itself was coming to life. Mom frantically read from the journal, piecing together fragments of the incantation. From mortal flesh to spirit-bound, by ancient oath, release be found. Her voice wavered, skipping the missing words. The lock glowed faintly, but it didn't open. Suddenly, the corridor behind us erupted with noise. Rattling chains, scraping footsteps, and a chorus of tortured screams. Jonah pointed the flashlight into the darkness, revealing multiple shadowy figures drifting toward us, their faces contorted in silent cries. My blood ran cold. It was as if the entire labyrinth had awakened at once. Furious we were tampering with its ancient seal. Dad tugged at the lock, desperate to break it, but it held fast. The shadows surged, crossing the distance in horrifying lurches. One of them, tall and misshapen, slithered close enough that I could see its sunken eyes. It lifted a skeletal hand, pointing accusingly. My mother's voice rose in urgency, chanting the incomplete incantation again. The chain rattled violently. Sparks flew as the iron links loosened but didn't fully break. Time seemed to slow. Jonah clung to me, terror etched on his face. Dad shouted, "Keep going, we're almost there." But the words drowned in the din of the screaming spirits. I felt my mind teeter on the edge of panic, uncertain whether we were doing the right thing or inviting catastrophe. I refused to let terror paralyze me. Gripping the lantern with one hand, I rummaged through the stack of dusty scrolls in my pack, praying to find a more complete version of the incantation. Meanwhile, Mom continued to recite the tattered lines aloud, her voice quaking. Miraculously, I found a torn page with additional words. They appeared to match the missing lines from the journal. I held it close to the lantern's flame, squinting to make them out. "May the sorrow of centuries pass, from blood to flame, from darkness to ash." When Mom read the lines, the lock glowed brighter, and the chain groaned. The spirit in front of us screeched in fury, as if it knew we'd discovered a key to its fate. Its twisted limbs clawed at the air, inching ever closer. Dad, grimacing, smeared more of his blood across the lock, repeating the final words, "From darkness to ash." The labyrinth reverberated with a resonant hum, drowning out even the wails of the spirits. A searing light erupted from the archway, forcing us to shield our eyes. When the light subsided, the lock and chain lay broken on the ground. The arch itself shimmered with residual energy. For one fleeting moment, the spirits recoiled, their forms flickering like images projected on broken glass. I glimpsed a flash of relief. Could spirits show relief on their disfigured faces? Then they vanished, leaving the corridor eerily still. The chain now broken, we cautiously stepped through the archway. My heart pounded, unsure if we'd unleashed something worse or actually freed the damned souls. Beyond the threshold, the corridor led into a high-ceiling chamber unlike any we'd seen so far. Grand pillars lined the walls, carved with scenes of people kneeling in supplication before monstrous figures. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, circled by unlit torches. Dad nudged the remains of the chain aside, grimacing at the dripping blood on his hand. "We should clean that," Mom murmured, passing him a rag. Despite the concern, we pressed on. Our sense of urgency overshadowed any minor wound. Atop the platform, we found a large stone altar. Symbols etched around its base glowed faintly, residual energy from the incantation, perhaps. We discovered more runic text, some in the same archaic English as the journal. This place felt like the heart of the labyrinth's power, where the final fate of the trapped spirits might be decided. Jonah ran his hand over the altar's surface, hesitant yet curious. "It's warm," he said, eyes wide. A hush fell over us, replaced by the low hum of unseen forces swirling around the chamber. We all felt it, a pulse, rhythmic, as though the labyrinth had a beating heart. Suddenly, I noticed something carved onto the far side of the altar, a small indentation shaped like a human hand. Without speaking, we all glanced at Dad's hand, still bearing a fresh cut. A silent agreement formed between us. We had come this far, we couldn't turn back. Dad, jaw set, pressed his palm against the carved handprint. First, nothing happened. Then the entire chamber trembled, and a ring of ghostly fire ignited in the torches around us. A roar of whispers filled the air. 1,000 voices layered on top of one another, some pleading, some raging. My heart pounded in my ears. Dad winced, sweat beading on his forehead. Mom cried out, reaching for him as the altar began to glow under his palm. Suddenly, a vortex of swirling light erupted above the altar. Within it, shapes formed, countless faces, twisted by pain but also tinged with longing. I recognized some from the corridors, the skeletal remains, the shadowy forms. This was all of them, the souls trapped here for centuries. An immense pressure bore down on us. Jonah gasped, dropping to his knees. The swirling faces seemed to watch us, waiting for a verdict. Something told me that we held the power now, to either release them from their torment or condemn them further. Dad's voice shook as he tried to speak. We set you free. Go on, find peace, he shouted, though uncertainty tinged his words. For an agonizing moment, nothing changed. Then a gentle wind brushed through the chamber, and many of the spectral faces drifted upward into the vortex. Their expressions softened, and one by one, they disappeared in a blinding surge of light. As the vortex above the altar faded, we realized not all the spirits had gone. Several lingered, forms coalescing into more solid apparitions, faces twisted in malevolent fury. Mom stepped back, alarmed. I could practically feel the hatred radiating from these spirits. They refused release, bound by vengeance and rage rather than sorrow. The largest among them, its eyes burning like embers, let out a guttural hiss. "We remain undone," it rasped, voice distorted and cruel. My father's hand slipped from the altar, and he staggered backward. The circle of torches flared again, as if responding to these dark entities. Jonah whimpered, gripping my sleeve. I swallowed hard, recalling the ancient texts that spoke of vengeful spirit, too consumed by anger to ever find peace. These apparitions were exactly that, a presence so burdened by wrath they refused redemption. One spirit drifted close, its face inches from mine. I couldn't move, rooted by a paralyzing dread. Then, to my horror, it reached a translucent arm straight into my chest. I felt a freezing ache seize my heart, stealing my breath. Dad lunged forward, calling my name, but the spirit had already pulled back, leaving me gasping. The torches flared once more, and the malevolent spirits vanished into the corridors beyond, their parting shrieks echoing in the distance. Tears stung my eyes. I felt violated, like a piece of me had been clawed away. Dad and Mom looked shaken, fear etched across their faces. We had freed many souls, but we'd also awakened something far darker. Unwilling to linger in the heart of the labyrinth, we decided to backtrack toward the opening we'd created in the living room floor. The realization that some spirits refused release and now roamed freely gnawed at us. Still, the corridor leading back seemed different, as though the tunnels had shifted. A hush fell over us as we found collapsed passages, newly formed cracks, and pools of stagnant water that hadn't been there before. The labyrinth was changing, perhaps reacting to the unleashed power. The once steady whispering now erupted in bursts of manic laughter, or vanished altogether, leaving haunting silence. Every so often, we caught glimpses of those malevolent spirits in the distance, their eyes flickering like dying embers. They never attacked outright, but they trailed us like predators. My chest still ached from the spirit's touch, a coldness that spread through my ribs. Jonah tried to help me walk when I stumbled, but the cold only intensified if anyone touched me. We turned another corner and nearly cried out in relief upon seeing a faint shaft of light from above. Our living room floor, our way out. Dad hurried forward, calling out, "We're almost there." But before we could climb the makeshift ladder, a violent quake tore through the corridor. The ceiling cracked open, sending chunks of earth and stone crashing down. With a deafening roar, our exit collapsed into rubble, sealing us underground again. Dust filled the air, choking us. Mom's eyes welled with tears. Jonah kicked at the rubble in frustration. Dad closed his eyes, struggling for composure. We couldn't give in to despair. We had to keep moving. The corridor shook again, a distant tremor hinting at further collapses. In the flickering lantern light, I noticed a slim passage branching off to the right, one we'd never seen before. Perhaps the labyrinth had shifted or revealed a hidden route. We followed the new path, our breath echoing in the stillness. The temperature dropped the deeper we went, leaving my bones aching with cold. The corridor eventually opened onto a partially flooded chamber. Dark water lapped at our ankles. The stench was foul, rotten, and stale. Skirting the water's edge, we discovered a row of decorative urns perched on ledges carved into the walls. Each urn bore faint inscriptions, possibly names. One had toppled over, shattered on the floor. Gray ash spread across the wet stones, swirling ominously in the water. Something caught my eye, a narrow wooden door on the far side of the chamber. I felt an odd flicker of hope. If we could get past it, maybe there was another way out. The doors would look ancient but intact. Gingerly, Dad pushed it open, and I braced for more horrors. Instead, a cramped spiral staircase led upward. My heart surged. Could this be our route to the surface? We climbed the spiral staircase, each step feeling like it might give way. Dim torchlight from our lantern danced off the moist stone walls, casting flickering shadows of our own weary forms. The further we ascended, the more intense my chest's cold ache grew, as if something was tugging at my heart from below, trying to pull me back. Halfway up, Jonah suddenly froze. He gripped the railing, face pale. Did you hear that?" he whispered. We paused, hearts pounding in unison. A faint scraping noise spiraled up from the darkness beneath us, accompanied by low, guttural breathing. A swirl of black mist coalesced at the bottom of the staircase. It expanded, twisting into a shape bearing a distorted face. One of the vengeful spirits had followed us, and it appeared furious. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, fixated on Jonah. Instinctively, Dad pushed Jonah forward, urging him to climb faster. Mom and I followed, adrenaline surging. The staircase felt endless. The spirit's raspy breaths echoed behind us, and every so often, I glanced down to see it ascending, floating just above the steps, drawing closer. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but we didn't stop until we saw a wooden trapdoor overhead. Dad slammed his shoulder against it. With a final, desperate shove, it cracked open. Light poured in, so bright it momentarily blinded me. We scrambled out onto dusty floorboards in what looked like an old attic. Jonah yanked the trapdoor shut behind us, and Dad slid a heavy crate over it. My ears rang with the spirit's furious shrieks from below, muffled by the thick wooden barrier. For now, we were safe. But for how long? Blinking against the daylight streaming through attic windows, I realized we'd emerged into another part of our house, or so it appeared. Dust-laden furniture and stacks of old boxes filled the space. Had we discovered a sealed-off portion of the attic we never knew existed? Jonah coughed, and Dad checked the gash on his hand. It was still bleeding slightly, but we had bigger concerns. Mom gently guided us toward the attic door. We descended creaking stairs into a hallway that indeed connected to our home. Relief washed over us. We were back, yet everything felt haunted by the memory of that labyrinth beneath our floor. Downstairs, the living room was eerily calm. The boards Dad had pried up had replaced themselves somehow. The floor showed no sign of disturbance. We stared in disbelief. It was as if our entryway into the labyrinth had vanished completely, leaving no trace. Had the house itself sealed the opening once the ritual was done? Outside, the late afternoon sun glowed warm on our faces. Yet, when I closed my eyes, I still felt that cold ache in my chest. Some of those vengeful spirits were now free roaming. What would that mean for us, for anyone? That night, after we cleaned up and tried to resume life, we heard a faint scraping under the floor again, just for a moment. In it, I thought I heard a single whisper, "We remember, we never found the labyrinth's entrance again." Contractors inspected everything and found only solid foundation. Yet, that persistent feeling of being watched never truly left. Every so often, I catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, or Jonah hears a soft voice calling his name at night. We saved many spirits from eternal torment, but we also unleashed a new darkness. And I have a sinking feeling that our quiet, suburban life will never be the same.